Welcome to another deep dive today. We're going to be looking into a pretty chilling story, a story of sin and the consequences of sin. And we're going to be looking at the life of Peter Niers,
Right.
a figure from 16th century Germany whose crimes shocked people even in that tumultuous era.
Yeah, you know what's really fascinating about Niers is that his story almost becomes a parable.
Okay.
It becomes this cautionary tale.
Yeah.
You know, it illustrates the nature of sin and how sin can twist even the most normal person
Right.
into a monster. You might even call it a Gollumization,
Oh,
a descent into darkness that mirrors the creature from Tolkien's famous work.
Gollumization. Yeah, that's a very interesting way to put it. And we're lucky that we have a lot of sources
Yeah.
to draw from here. We have historical accounts, we have pamphlets,
Yeah.
and we even have ballads that capture how fascinated and horrified the public was
Right.
by this figure.
Yeah, and you know, if we look at all of these sources, we can kind of see how each sin that Niers committed seemed to demand an even greater transgression from him.
Wow.
And it kept pulling him deeper and deeper into this abyss until finally his actions became truly horrific.
So let's start by setting the stage. Germany in the 1500s.
Yeah.
As a lot of you probably know, was a period of immense social and political upheaval. The Peasants' War had just ended,
Right.
and it left scars across the land. And it wasn't just about political power. It was about poverty, inequality, and a deep sense of injustice
Right.
that permeated through society.
And you know, this atmosphere of unrest and lawlessness really created a fertile ground
Yeah.
for people like Niers to thrive. He was born into poverty around 1540, and from the very beginning he felt trapped
Oh, wow.
by his circumstances. He was convinced that honest work would never allow him to escape the
Right.
cycle of poverty.
I can only imagine the resentment and bitterness that would create.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that while his desire to escape poverty was understandable,
Right.
it was his response to it.
Yeah.
His choice to embrace the anger and resentment that put him on such a dangerous path. Instead of seeking solace in faith, he looked for power through illicit means. He joined a band of bandits,
Oh, wow.
led by a man named Martin Stier.
Martin Stier, a shepherd turned outlaw. What a contrast. That's somebody who should embody peace and simplicity, instead choosing a life of violence and crime.
Right.
It really speaks volumes about the desperation of the times.
It does. And for Niers, this was a pivotal moment when he joined Stier's gang.
Okay.
This is the point where he crossed the line
Yeah.
and embraced a life outside of the law and outside of morality. It's like he was rejecting the legitimate means of improving his life.
Right.
And by doing so, opening himself up to darker influences.
It's like the beginning of that Gollumization that you mentioned.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And if we go deeper into the sources, we start to see this Gollumization really taking hold. Some accounts actually claim that when he was with Stier,
Okay.
Niers was exposed to dark rituals and black magic.
Wow.
They talk about ceremonies in the woods, attempts to summon demonic forces, and
That's
even
right.
sacrifices.
That's a chilling thought,
Yeah.
especially when you consider how seriously people took witchcraft and the occult.
Right.
It wasn't just superstition back then. People really believed in the power of these dark forces.
And for somebody like Niers, who was already so full of resentment and bitterness,
Right.
dabbling in the occult would have been a very dangerous temptation.
Yeah.
It would have been offering a shortcut to power,
Right.
a way to exert control over this world that he felt had wronged him.
Right.
Every choice he made was drawing him further and further away from God's grace,
Yeah.
deeper and deeper into the shadows.
It was like every sin that he committed became a stepping stone to a greater transgression.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Think about it. He started by rejecting honest work. Then he embraced a life of crime.
Right.
And then ultimately sought power
Yeah.
through these forbidden dark practices. Each step led him further down a path to his ruin.
So we have Niers, now a hardened criminal steeped in the occult,
Yeah.
fueled by resentment. What happens next in this tragic tale? What makes him descend into this real depravity that makes him infamous?
Well, a pivotal moment happens in 1572 when his mentor, Martin Stier, is captured and executed. And instead of being a warning to Niers,
Yeah.
this actually pushes him further down this path of darkness. He forms his own gang.
Wow.
And their reign of terror eclipses even the brutality of Stier's band. For over a decade, they just terrorized the countryside.
Wow.
They left a trail of blood and fear everywhere they went. The sources we have talk about acts of unbelievable cruelty.
It's hard to even fathom that kind of depravity.
It is.
It's really disturbing to think that as Niers descended into darkness,
Right.
he seemed to embrace that image of evil that everyone was putting on him.
Right. That's a key part of this whole Gollumization thing.
Yeah.
As his crimes got worse and worse,
Right.
the public stopped seeing him as just a criminal.
Yeah.
He became a monster.
What?
A boogeyman. People would whisper about him in hushed tones. Pamphlets and ballads started depicting him as a shape-shifting sorcerer.
It's almost as if society just couldn't handle how bad his crimes were.
Right.
They needed to make him into something other than human.
Exactly. It's easier to believe in a monster or a demon than to accept that a human being can be capable of such darkness.
But this Gollumization of Niers almost helped him in a way.
How so?
Well, it fed his own sense of power.
Oh, absolutely. As these stories spread, as people started fearing him, Niers just embraced this image.
Right.
He became a creature of darkness. It gave him a twisted sense of control.
Wow.
He could instill terror and exert his will over the world that he felt had wronged him.
There are even accounts of him cannibalizing his victims and using body parts of infants for rituals.
Yeah.
It's just gruesome.
It is. These details might be exaggerated.
Right.
But they reflect the deep fear he evoked.
Of course.
It just highlights how sin, when it's left unchecked, can twist our humanity into something truly grotesque.
It's like a reminder that the path of sin is so slippery.
Yeah.
One transgression leads to another,
Absolutely.
pulling you further away from God's grace.
Right.
Until you become unrecognizable.
And this is what happened to Niers. His descent into darkness lasted for over a decade.
Wow.
But in 1577, after years of avoiding capture, he was finally caught.
I bet people were so relieved.
Oh, yeah. But his story doesn't end there.
Wow.
No. Under torture, he confessed to 75 murders.
75.
Yeah. But that number is probably much higher.
Wow.
And then he escaped.
He escaped.
He escaped from prison.
Can you imagine the fear? This monster was on the loose again.
I know. People were terrified. This escape really solidified his image as a supernatural being.
Right.
The ballads and pamphlets from that time are filled with tales of shape-shifting and his cleverness.
But of course, those were exaggerations.
Right. They were trying to explain what seemed impossible.
Of course.
But even though he didn't have any supernatural powers, he was definitely a master of disguise and deception.
Right.
His ability to blend into society, to hide his true nature, that's another part of this Gollumization.
He was a wolf in sheep's clothing.
Exactly. Moving among the people he was preying on.
It's like he embodied deception itself.
Right. He was a living example of how sin can corrupt someone.
Wow. But he couldn't hide forever.
No, eventually his luck ran out. In 1581, he was betrayed.
Oh, no.
And captured again, and this time there was no escape.
This is the beginning of the end for Peter Niers.
It is.
And it sounds like he got what he deserved.
His punishment was brutal.
Yeah.
It was a public spectacle of torture that lasted for 3 days.
3 days.
They started by tearing his flesh,
Oh, my God.
pouring hot oil into the wounds.
That's unimaginable.
On the second day, they roasted his feet over hot coals.
This is horrific.
And on the third day, he was put on the breaking wheel.
The breaking wheel.
Yeah, it's a terrible device designed to crush and shatter bones.
I can't even imagine that level of brutality. It seems like they had a much different understanding of sin and punishment back then.
They did. While we might be shocked by this kind of violence today,
Right.
back then, punishment was seen as a way to get revenge. It was about making things right. It wasn't just about preventing future crime. It was about inflicting suffering equal to the evil that was committed.
But how does the church reconcile this kind of punishment
Right.
with its teachings on mercy and redemption? Could someone like Niers, even after everything he did,
Right.
be forgiven?
That's a very profound question. While the church condemns sin,
Right.
it also stresses the importance of God's mercy
Right.
and the possibility of redemption, even for the most terrible sins.
Yes, so even someone like Niers could find forgiveness.
Absolutely. If in his final moments he truly repented, acknowledged his sins, and asked for God's mercy.
So there's always hope.
There is. Unfortunately, the sources don't tell us if Niers felt any remorse.
Right.
We can only hope that he found some peace, some glimmer of God's grace in the midst of that horror.
His story is so difficult to process.
Yes.
It's a chilling example of how destructive sin can be and how depraved humans can be.
It is. But it also reminds us how important it is to seek God's grace.
Yes.
And to resist those temptations that lead us down those dark paths.
It's also a good example of that Gollumization you were talking about.
It is both for individuals and for society as a whole.
Right.
When we let fear, anger, and resentment control us,
Yeah.
we risk becoming the very monsters that we're afraid of.
Niers let his resentment consume him, And he embraced that monstrous image.
He did.
And society, with their fear and their desire for revenge, probably made it worse.
You could say that they pushed him further away from redemption.
It's a cautionary tale that shows us that we need to be responsible for confronting evil.
Yes, both individually and together.
We need to guard our own hearts against sin.
Right.
And we need to be compassionate to those who have strayed from the right path.
Yeah, it really makes you think. It's easy to look at someone like Niers and think that could never be me.
Right. But his story shows us
That we all have that darkness inside of us.
absolutely. So how can we protect ourselves from becoming like him?
Well, I think it starts with being humble,
Okay.
recognizing that we're all capable of sin,
Right.
and we always need God's grace.
We have to be careful not to let resentment and greed take over.
Exactly. Even small sins can become big problems.
Right. It's like a snowball effect.
Yeah, and it's about choosing to do what's right, even when it's hard, even when we want to take the easy way out.
It's about making those tough choices.
It is. And we can't forget to lean on our faith,
Right.
find comfort in prayer and in the community of the church. We're not meant to go through this alone.
That's a good point. It's
Yeah.
comforting to remember that,
Yeah,
especially when you think about the darkness that people like Niers represent.
it is. It reminds us that even when things are bad,
Yeah.
faith and the hope of redemption are always there.
Well, this has been quite a deep dive
It has.
into the life and crimes of Peter Niers.
A very dark but very interesting story.
It is. So as we wrap up, what are some final thoughts you can leave us with?
I'd like everyone to think about this idea of Gollumization.
Okay.
Not just with Niners, but in your own lives too.
Right.
Look inside yourself. What temptations do you face? Are there any choices you're making that go against what you know is right? Are you holding on to any anger or resentment?
Powerful questions.
Remember, doing the right thing isn't always easy.
It's not, but it's the path to true peace.
Exactly.
Thank you for taking us through this difficult topic.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you to everyone listening.
Yes, thank you all for joining us on this deep dive.
Into the dark side of human nature.
May your faith guide you.
As you make your way through life and choose the light over darkness.